Hi there. Welcome to Get Productive with Microsoft Azure Deployment Templates. This is episode 10, Design ARM Template Variables. My name is Tim Warner. Our two learning goals for this lesson are as follows. We're going to define what ARM template variables are. Then in a hands-on demo, we'll implement variables according to Microsoft's published ARM template guidelines, also called proven practices. Go to timw.info/ARM to see the interactive course table of contents. What is a variable? Well, we could have this discussion just in the name of computer programming in general, but as you know, I want to scope this series as tightly as possible. In ARM templates, variables represent static or dynamic data that are resolved by Azure Resource Manager prior to deployment. Now, static means you've got a variable with a fixed value. Dynamic is where we can implement some of those ARM template functions to dynamically resolve resource IDs, to generate globally unique IDs, concatenate strings. And prior to deployment, Azure takes care of resolving the final variable value, and then you use those values throughout the rest of your template. Specifically, whereas parameters represent data that you send into the deployment and allow your code to be more modular, variables represent internal data that you want to reference one or more times in the resources part and maybe even the output part of your template. As I mentioned, the ARM specification has a number of built-in functions. We'll be covering functions separately as we go along here. And I'd like to pass on a proven practice, and that is to get into the habit of handling your parameters with variables. You'll see what that means more when we do our demo in just a moment. But you have to remember that parameters exist outside the template, whereas the variables are completely inside or internal to the template. So where you're putting your ARM templates, you could be using a DevOps product and doing ARM template deployments from within a CI, continuous integration pipeline. And you can use the parameters to specify what eventually turns into variables that eventually are referenced inside in the resources part of your template. I hope that makes sense. All right, well, let's get this party started. I'm going to teach you a bit about variables in ARM templates now. And one of my favorite things to do as an instructor is apply learning that we picked up previously in a course. And in the previous lesson, we looked at snippets. So I want to verify my storage account snippet. Here in VS Code, I'll open the command palette. I'll type snippet and press enter, and then type ARM to filter my snippets list to look at my Azure Resource Manager snippets that come from the ARM Tools extension. As you can see, I've found the section in the file where we have the storage account snippet. And if you haven't watched the previous lesson, I do give a little disclaimer about being careful to edit Microsoft's snippet file here, because when you update the extension, if Microsoft has a more recent version of this file, it's going to get overwritten. So you could keep these custom ARM template snippets in a separate global file. That's another discussion for another time. You might remember that in the previous lesson, I had a typo. If you look on line 2253, I had mentioned that you can create these tab stop indices using 1, 2, 3, 4. And by using this pipe syntax, you can do a comma-separated list array that opens up a drop-down list control when you bring the snippet in and you use the tab completion. But my error is that I had a space after this comma. You're going to want to make sure that there's no spaces there, okay? All right, so let's come back to my blank Azure deploy.json file. And speaking of snippets, I'm going to type ARM and press tab to bring in just an empty template. And then for resources, I'm going to come into the array and type storage until I highlight ARM storage and press tab. And then, as you know from yesterday, we have our tab stops outlined, or we can just click right in, which is what I want to do. First thing we want to do is consider the storage account name, which needs to be globally unique. So I'm going to use the light bulb control here to extract this as a parameter. I'm going to give it a name, stg prefix, press enter. And for the description, I'm just going to put some nice helpful information for my teammates. Storage account names are globally unique between 3 and 24 characters. Alphanumeric, lowercase. That's a proven practice right there, is to document your parameters so your teammates know exactly what's going on here. And remember, we're hyper-focusing. We're not going to walk through a full deployment here. We're just going to look at the proven practice of catching your input data during deployment or at deployment time via parameters, but we're actually going to handle this storage prefix parameter in the variables section. So let's come into variables, come in between the curly braces, press enter, and I'm going to create stg for storage account name. And I'm using camel case, which again is one of those best practices. Colon, and then I'm going to do quote and square brackets. Remember that this way to do a value where you have in double quotes the square brackets tells Azure Resource Manager that you want to do an expression. And we have immediate access via the ARM Tools extension and IntelliSense. We have access to all of those template functions. So a common pattern for variables is to take advantage of some of these functions, and it can help you generate names that are almost guaranteed or nearly guaranteed to be globally unique. So in this case, for our storage account name, let's say our pattern is going to concatenate. So notice I start to type, and then I press Tab to fill out that function. Functions have the trigger word, and then the arguments that you pass into a function are enclosed in parentheses. And what I'm going to do here is capture a reference to that STG prefix parameter by calling a built-in function with the appropriate name parameters. So I'll type PARA tab. We have to do our arguments again here, and notice that we can press Tab to bring in storage prefix, just like that. We're not finished yet with this expression. We're concatenating the storage prefix that's coming in dynamically via our input parameter, and then in this example, I'm going to prepend just an integer value, or it could be alphanumeric, proj 1, let's say. Maybe the naming convention that you and your team have devised is the pattern for prefixes and suffixes. So you need to think to yourself, how much of your variable value do you want to be fixed? Because ideally over time, in the name of maintenance, you don't want to be having to come into variables and horsing around with static values like I have here. Again, the practice is to make the dynamic inputs parameters and then handle or reference those parameters as you create your variables, you see? So now I've got this variable that defines the storage account name. That's excellent. And we can see in the resources section when ARM is actually going to create the storage account, it wants to use the parameter here, but we don't want that. So I'm going to get rid of this call to parameter, and instead in the resources part, we're going to internally reference, wait for it, variables. Open parentheses, tab, storage account name. There you have it. Now we're making our code much more modular and flexible because those parameters are the only part of the template that exists outside of it in terms of you'll be using those parameters in your build pipelines and so forth. Okay? So let me come down to the end of this resources block, put in a comma, and just for the sake of conversation, let's say that we wanted to deploy not only the storage account, but a function app. So I'll type FUNC and press Tab to create a snippet definition for the Azure function. And again, there's dependencies and stuff in here that we haven't gotten to in the course yet. So I just want to hyper-focus your attention to the fact that an Azure function app has a dependency on a storage account. So on line 40, notice that we've got a depends on statement that's looking for the resource ID of a particular storage account. And storage account name is just the placeholder that the author of this snippet, Sam Kogan, used. We can select the single quotes and the object name, and instead we're going to look for the resource ID, getting the name of the storage account via, yes indeed, there we have our reference to the variable. And we can do the same thing elsewhere in the function app definition. As you can see, whenever we're referencing storage account name, we can simply grab that value, and I can again bring up my variables tab, and I've got my reference to storage account name. So there it is. Those are some proven practices presented, I think, in a very practical context on how you can implement variables in your ARM templates. For further learning, check out Microsoft's official templates variable reference, timw.info/temp10a, Microsoft's best practices for ARM template development, timw.info/temp10b, and I found a great, useful blog article from a Deloitte consultant, and it deals with ARM templates do's and don'ts. That's at timw.info/temp10c. Thanks very much. In the next lesson, we're going to look at the other side of the coin here, and we'll integrate parameters into our ARM templates. Find the course TOC again at timw.info/ARM. My Twitter handle's TechTrainerTim. My Pluralsight courses are at timw.info/PS, and my website is techtrainertim.com. Take good care.